Alexander Mercouris of the Duran mentioned something interesting today, something that I hadn't realised before, and which I think is part of the reason we're seeing the Ukrainian offensive struggle so far. He was talking about Joe Biden and his agreement to approve the release and supply of cluster munitions, cluster bombs, to the Ukrainians. Now, these cluster munitions, as we know, are weapons which 100 countries or more have signed on to ban the use of them. Primarily the reason being is that they have duds, they don't all explode, and so you end up with them littering the ground. And once the hostilities have completed, civilians then are impacted by them. As civilians move back into an area to rehabilitate, to clean the area up, to rebuild, to work in farms and plough fields, they encounter these unexploded mines or bomblets or whatever they might be that have been dropped in a cluster, and they then begin as civilians to suffer the consequences of the use of those. And this is why many nations have signed on to global agreements to outlaw the use of them. Interestingly, the United States and Russia, and interestingly, even Cambodia, where Cambodia is one of the countries most impacted by landmines, the use of landmines, many of which are scattered in these ways. They haven't signed on to these agreements. Cambodia, I read, they have sent a delegate to when they had a big summit about the use of landmines. But due to what they thought as possible future conflicts, they weren't at that stage willing to sign on to a moratorium to ban the use of them by Cambodia. But anyhow, so Alexander was talking about how Biden has come out and said, yes, they can be provided to Ukraine. And the reason given for this is that the Ukrainians are running out of normal ammunition. Now, this in itself is problematic for the Ukrainians because they're going to be receiving cluster mine shells now. So these shells can be fired from artillery, 155 millimeter supposedly. However, these aren't high explosive shells. These are shells that fly into the air and then erupt into smaller bomblets, and they rain down over an area, but with much smaller impact. These aren't the sort of shells that you can use for destroying a tank or busting through a concrete bunker. So the impact of these is going to be limited for the Ukrainians. The advisor, Jake Sullivan, US advisor to the president, he has stated that this is done as a bridging activity to allow the West to find ways to produce more normal unitary 155 millimeter shells and provide them. Anyhow, so Alexander was talking about all of this, and he mentioned the Kharkiv offensive of last year, when the Ukrainians were able to push the Russians out of Kharkiv, and how that's been considered to be in many circles a great success, one of the two big successes that the Ukrainian armed forces have had during this conflict. The other being the forcing of the Russian forces out of the Kherson region, forcing them across the Dnieper River from the west side to the east side. Now, I'll come back to that in a moment. But what was interesting that Alexander spoke about was that in the original Kharkiv offensive, where the Ukrainians were successful in pushing out the Russian forces, there wasn't Russian minefields involved in that. So at that period of time, when that had happened, the Russians hadn't gone and mined those areas in the Kharkiv region. And when we contrast that to what we've seen in the last month, where the Ukrainians in the new offensive have very early on in the piece encountered Russian minefields, and we've seen the devastating impact that has had upon the armoured vehicles and infantry fighting vehicles and even tanks and even the mine-clearing tanks of the Ukrainian forces. It did make me start to think that all through this conflict, people have been looking for the game-changing weapons. There's been talk of it being the Stinger missiles, or the Patriot air defence systems, or perhaps the Leopard tanks and the F-16s. Now, I think that the game changers may actually just have been the deployment of an old traditional weapon and using mines. The Ukrainians in the Kharkiv offensive last year were able to move through that area rapidly, and that's not what they've been able to do this time. So there is something that is different. In both situations, the Russians have had artillery and have had drones. Now, the drones are the other real game changer, I think, in this conflict. They are the one thing which we have seen has really changed the face of battle. The way that drones can allow a single soldier to sit in the relative security of a trench, out of the way of the artillery, the enemy's shelling, out of the way of machine gun fire, and be able to control through a first-person view a drone that carries ordnance and can be flown into a piece of armor. So a single soldier, relatively protected on the battlefield, can now take out an individual tank or armoured personnel carrier or fighting vehicle, or even command post. If they're able to identify a command post, they can fly that grenade or piece of ordnance on the drone into that area and take out command centres. This is something that soldier can then do over and over and over during the course of a day. And if that soldier flying those drones is paired up with a reconnaissance drone. So again, when I'm talking about reconnaissance drones, I'm not talking about the large Global Hawk and Reapers. Instead here, I'm talking about really just retail quality drones that you can buy for a few $100s or less. But they're able to be flown up with relatively good speed. They're small. They can get to good height. They've got good cameras on them. So a few of those in the air being nimble, it's very difficult to shoot down. I've seen footage of people trying to shoot them down with machine guns. And this footage was actually of a drone which was remaining stable because it was dropping a grenade. Even that took quite a few shots to bring down. So one that is moving around, very difficult to bring down. Obviously, electronic warfare could be used to disrupt that, but if you're able to bypass that, suddenly now you've got eyes in the sky, multiple pairs, able to cover different areas at once, be able to actually, unlike for example, a plane, which will fly along on a particular route, these drones can get down to ground level. They can land if they need to. They can fly into a building and look into a building. They can circle a building. So the knowledge you get from them is far superior to just flying a plane over in the past, or perhaps even a helicopter flying over in the past. So those drones teamed up with a group of soldiers all flying drones with ordnance is the real game changer here. But just going back to the fact that was already in existence in the Kharkiv offensive last year, perhaps not quite to the same level as it is now, and perhaps not quite with the same tactics that the Russians would be employing now for another 6 or 9 months of experience. So the difference there seems to be that the Ukrainians were able to push the Russians out of the Kharkiv region, and part of that reason may have been because there were no minefields there at that time. Now, why did the Russians not mine the Kharkiv area? That's an interesting one. There were apparently only relatively small number of Russians in that area at that time. Perhaps the Russians had determined that they would already withdraw from that region if needed. Perhaps that was it. Perhaps they had made some decision, or some military decision had been made at that time not to use mines. purely because of the fact that the bad press that you receive if you do go and mine a country because they are left behind. And for years, Ukraine will suffer from this. Who knows? But it does seem as though the armoured forces, the armoured personnel carriers and fighting vehicles and tanks of the Ukrainians were able to proceed rapidly without encountering mines at that time. And that now we see is very different. So perhaps that is part of the game-changing face of what's happening in the war at the moment. This combination of drones and mines may be what has really stopped the Ukrainian offensive pretty much in its tracks at this stage. Now, with only a few days to go before the NATO summit in Vilnius, there's some interesting news today about Turkey and President Erdogan's decision to release back to Ukraine some of the Azov commanders of Azov units, the Ukrainian assault forces, who had been taken prisoner by the Russians and were being detained in Turkey. Now, this perhaps seems to be some retaliation from Turkey against Russia's decision to not extend the Black Sea grain deal. The Black Sea grain deal is an agreement that's been brokered by Turkey and between Russia and Ukraine, which allows the access to 3 ports in Odessa. The Russians have agreed not to blockade those 3 ports with the Black Sea Russian fleet. And the agreement was that would allow for both Ukrainian and Russian goods to be transported out of those ports and through the Bosphorus and then the Dardanelles. Turkey was involved in brokering that agreement, and in the last few months, the Russians have complained that some of their requirements for keeping that deal going have not been upheld. These are things like insurance being provided on Russian freighters, so that the Russian ships that go through there will be given insurance by the global shipping companies and therefore allowed to berth and port in other areas. In the shipping world, if you can't get insurance on your ship, then you can have trouble with the ports that you're able to dock at and areas that you're able to pass through. For example, things like the Bosphorus Straits or the Dardanelles Straits. Now, the reason that Turkey might be doing this, I've seen some reports that this may be a political move, where Erdogan is doing this now, is releasing these prisoners now, so that he can be seen to have been tough on Russia for cutting short or stopping the extension of the grain deal. Although, another thing might just be that Turkey has just raised the per tonnage fee they charge for allowing freight to pass through the Bosphorus. From memory, I think it went up from like $4.08 per tonne to $4.42. So for every tonne of shipment that comes through those straits that Turkey control, Turkey charges a fee on them. Now, if Russia is saying that they're no longer going to honour the Black Sea grain agreement, which means they will recommence the blockade of those ports in Odessa, which will stop all Ukrainian transport out through the Black Sea, through the Bosphorus and the Dardanelles, will also stop Russian transport through there. Suddenly, we see that Turkey now will lose quite a bit of income. Now, I don't know what the daily, weekly or monthly shipping quantities through there are, but in the last year, there was, I think, reports of 30 million tonnes of grain had been allowed through on this grain deal. So 30 million tonnes at $5 or thereabouts a tonne. That's $150 million. That's quite a bit of revenue for Turkey, which they will now lose if the Russians blockade those ports. Turkey's in an interesting position. Turkey is needing to straddle its NATO membership, because it is a member state of NATO, and its proximity and economic relationship with Russia. Now, Russia is one of Turkey's major trading partners. They're separated by the Black Sea, but the Black Sea, which is the port through the Mediterranean area, the Middle East area, to get through to this area to Russia, all shipping traffic needs to go through the Bosphorus, which is controlled by the Turkish. So there's a revenue for Turkey in allowing Russian trade to occur through there. However, Turkey is a NATO member. So they also need to be seen to be playing along and towing the line with NATO and NATO requirements. Interestingly, Turkey, some while ago, purchased an S-400 air defense system from Russia. And at the time that they made that purchase, they were looking at buying F-35s from the United States. And that F-35 deal, in a reprisal for the purchasing of the S-400 system, was cancelled. So Turkey's an interesting country to watch. I often wonder if some of the actions taken by Turkey towards supporting Ukraine are done under duress in some respect. I don't think that Turkey have full commitment and support for Ukraine. And I think that Erdogan plays a fine line between playing Russia and the West off against each other and trying to find that balance and get the best for Turkey, as you would do, as any leader of their nation would do. But Turkey, to me, could become, in some respects, a kingmaker in this offensive and this conflict as it goes on, because they hold that position over freight travel out of the Black Sea. They do have S-400 systems and close ties with Russia, yet they're a NATO member. Interesting to see what happens there. Anyhow, that seems to be the big news for today. Turkey's activity there, Biden's agreement to send cluster munitions because the Ukrainians are running out of ammunition, as has been reported by many people. And this is not just Russian reporting. This is in the West. Even Jens Stoltenberg of the NATO, Secretary General of NATO, has indicated that the West has problems with supplying ammunition to Ukraine. And I think we will hear more about this in the coming days as we get to the NATO summit. That's only a few days away. So let's just see what happens between now and then with Ukraine trying to be able to demonstrate some sort of success in what appears to be a failed offensive. Look, thank you very much. Please subscribe to the channel if you enjoy these shows. Share with your friends. Put a like on there. That helps get this out to other people. And enjoy your weekend.